Now we come to the third part of the working session that Will Kent will take us through. If you just join us, I just wanted to reiterate that we are collecting all our questions in this document so that our speakers can follow up later if he runs out of time. In addition, if you are active Twitter user, please go ahead and tweet the session using this hashtag. We also have a Slack channel for this track. And lastly, by joining in this conference, you agree to adhere to these community participation guidelines. So if you have any questions, please contact the organizers as noted in these guidelines. Now, Liam will introduce our third working session headed by Will Kent from Wiki Education.
All right, and I will. Thank you very much, Jackie. So Will is the Wikidata Program Manager at Wiki Education, which is a separate nonprofit organization in North America, focusing on, obviously, education around Wikimedia projects. For the past year and a half, he has been specifically working on a training program for Wikidata and is particularly excited to teach new community members about it, and within this community of librarians and library adjacent people especially. Will was previously an instruction and electronic resources librarian, and he's particularly impressed and excited about the potential of linked data in classrooms and in improving representation on Wikimedia projects. So, without further ado, Will, are you here? Can you join us?
Yeah, can you hear me?
We can.
Can you see me?
We can see you.
Great. Cool. Well, thanks for that introduction. And Rob and Mahir, thanks for going first and setting this up. So, quick introduction. I do teach these Wikidata courses. I've taught them for a year. They're great. I see some familiar names in this meeting, and it's great to see those names, people who've taken the course before, just active community members. And what I wanted to make a presentation about was creating projects on Wikidata, because as Mahir and Rob have indicated, Wikidata is this vast, huge, interesting space, and it's not always easy to kind of articulate that space into a project that you can take back to your colleagues or your bosses and impress them. And so this is kind of a distillation of a lot of different conversations that I've had with course participants and some best practices that I've kind of stumbled upon to help better define Wikidata projects. And so I'm gonna share my screen. Can everyone see my presentation? And I will try to handle questions as best as I can.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Great, thanks. Okay, so developing a Wikidata project. Wikidata is ideal for projects because anyone can participate. It is free, it is open, the data is free, the data is open, you don't need to pay for it. If you end up giving your collection data to Wikidata, you can always take it back and use it. It doesn't vanish, it doesn't go anywhere. So I really do mean anyone can participate. It's a global project. It's open and free, we've already addressed that. It's multilingual, and this is something that needs to be emphasized over and over again. It doesn't matter what language you speak, you can always contribute to Wikidata. And in fact, I would encourage you, if you are multilingual, to contribute some translation projects on Wikidata. That's always a great facet for engaging on Wikidata. Wikidata isn't perfect. There are tons of knowledge gaps and places to improve, and I'll go into some specific details about that in just a little bit. But representation is key on the internet, and Wikidata is a great place to improve representation. Nearly all data is appropriate. I'll go into that asterisk in just a second. But if you have collections data, if you have data that you think needs to be shared, it's likely that Wikidata is a good fit for it. The asterisk, of course, refers to Wikidata's notability guidelines. Some things are a little too specific, but more likely than not, your data is appropriate for Wikidata. But it's kind of overwhelming. How do I get started? How do I frame this? How do I articulate a project? And so what I would recommend doing first is defining scope of a project. And that's easy enough to do if you represent a collection, if you have a specific goal or a mission in mind. But just going to Wikidata's homepage can be kind of overwhelming, especially if you don't know what you're doing or if you're new to Wikidata or Wikimedia projects. So how do you define your scope? You can pick a lot of specific places to begin on Wikidata. You can work with adding statements to items like Rob demonstrated earlier today, or like Mihir was talking about, you can work with lexemes, you can put together some queries. So let's use the data to kind of help us establish what a project could be. So there are a couple different ways that you can relate to data on Wikidata. You can add data to Wikidata, so you can contribute statements, references, qualifiers, ranks. You can pull data from Wikidata using the API, using queries, or you can combine the two and have some cool dynamic program or bot or script that cycles the data from Wikidata to your collection, from your collection to Wikidata. And this is kind of how I'll be building projects for the rest of my little session here. So that just covers what we talked about. So a couple of ways to pull data from Wikidata. There's the query service, which you need to use Sparkle to ask Wikidata for data. But the cool thing about it is that you can ask Wikidata for any kind of data. Any slice of Wikidata you want, you can get through the query service. You can get several different data types. You can specify time periods. You can get just images. So queries are a really, really good way to help define a project on Wikidata. And what a lot of people don't realize is that you don't need to know Sparkle to run queries. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of example queries that are accessible to you. And Wikidata being open and free, you don't need to ask permission. You can just use these queries that other people have written and tailor them to your collection, tailor them to the identifiers you want to look at, the series of properties that you're most interested in. And that's one really easy way to kind of set boundaries for a project. Another use of queries that a lot of people don't think of immediately are maintenance queries. So if you do have a project or a set of items or records that you're interested in moving over to Wikidata, you can use those queries to keep track of what exists versus what doesn't exist. The other way that you can pull data from Wikidata is the API. Wikidata does have a fully functional API, so if you have a background in calling data through APIs, you can build programs that pull specific sets of data using the API. I will say in a lot of the conferences I've attended and a lot of the community members I've worked with, queries are the more popular way of pulling data from Wikidata, if only because you can specify the output and you can get it in JSON, you can get it as a CSV file, and it's a little easier to customize and is more approachable in spite of being written in Sparkle. So there are two ways of approaching pulling data from Wikidata, and it's free. So let me emphasize that, and you can always use that data however you want. So that's pulling data from Wikidata. The other way that you can formulate a project is by adding data. So maybe some of us represent collections from libraries or museums, or we just want to use public data that doesn't yet exist on Wikidata. One really easy way to form a project around this is to create a new property. Anyone can create a property on Wikidata, which means that all of us can add to Wikidata's ontology, which is kind of cool. You can create a property that corresponds to authority control at your institution. So you can create a property that is an ID that you can map to your collection, which is a really easy way to add a vast amount of data to Wikidata. But you can also create a property that just represents a relationship in the world that exists on Wikidata. My favorite example from the courses that I've taught is that I had a participant notice that there was a conviction property on Wikidata, but there wasn't an exoneration property. And so he proposed that, and now that data can be represented on Wikidata. So in spite of Wikidata having, I think, nearly 8,000 properties, if not more, there are relationships that are not yet represented, and anyone can create a property. It's something that we can all do. So that's a really easy way to contribute to Wikidata. The other thing that you can do with properties is define their usage and work on their naming. So some of the issues with the sex and gender property came up earlier in our meeting today. And that's an ongoing discussion. And a lot of the ways that we conceptualize sex and gender has changed. And even the title itself is problematic. So just contributing to those conversations on Wikidata is a really great way to frame a project. The other thing you can do is contribute to a data model. There are some kind of formalized data models on Wikidata, but there's nothing saying that those can't change. And the way that we establish models on Wikidata is by community consensus. And so contributing to data models is a really great way to develop a project, whether it's bibliographic data models or models about people or things or places or events. It's really important to have lists of commonly used properties and different ways that people can engage with those properties. And there's no centralized body that creates them, it's just up to us. And so creating a series of data models is a really excellent way to establish a project on Wikidata. Another thing you can do is batch upload data. So if you have a lot of data from your collection, from works, from records, you can train yourself using tools and in a matter of clicks, upload all of those pieces of data to Wikidata. And this is a very common way that there are projects on Wikidata. As mentioned before, another way that you can approach adding data to Wikidata is reconciling identities. Mix and match is an excellent tool for doing that. There are other tools that you can use for reconciling identities, but that's a great way to contribute to Wikidata is reconciling identities. And then another way is to coordinate a Wiki project. Wiki projects are dedicated spaces on Wikidata for you to coordinate an effort around a discipline or an area of interest. There's specific pages, and it takes a lot of community work to run those. Let me just pause for a second. And check the chat because, okay, great. Just checking to see that everything's running smoothly. Okay, back to the presentation for a quick second. We are looking at adding data to Wikidata. Coordinating a Wiki project is a great way to get involved, and I'll point out ways to join a Wiki project. There are no specified rules around how a Wiki project is run. It's all determined by the community, but this is one of the most useful ways to coordinate efforts on Wikidata. The other way that you can contribute to Wikidata is cleaning up its taxonomy. There are a lot of questions around how items can relate to each other and which classes items fall into, and it is very hectic right now and could use a lot of support from metadata experts, library experts, and people who know a lot about how different items relate to each other. And again, anyone can work on this, and so this is a really easy way to scope a project and to kind of frame your time on Wikidata would be to contribute to its taxonomy. And I mentioned this earlier, but translating labels and descriptions and aliases into other languages encourages Wikidata to be more user-friendly to different language speakers, makes it more accessible to different language speakers, and makes it more usable for the whole entire world. So there's a lot of different ways that you can add to Wikidata and improve the data that already exists on Wikidata. And then there are projects that involve both pushing and pulling data. So getting data from Wikidata, downloading it, and maybe incorporating it into your own collection or your own tool, and then having that tool refine it and contribute that data back to Wikidata. So you can write scripts and bots, and I'm going to plug Steve's session tomorrow because it's going to be great, and he'll talk about some scripts and bots that he's been working on. So that's a really great case study in how to write scripts and bots for Wikidata. You can build a tool. All the tools that Wikidata uses were built by community members. So if you have any coding background or experience, or if you don't, and you just notice a gap in Wikidata in a way that a tool would improve editing life or data quality on Wikidata, feel free to propose it, and someone else might be able to write that tool. And then I would encourage you to make lists from queries that can help you track projects, that can help support other projects like projects on Wikipedia. I know Wikidata is used to monitor knowledge gaps on Wikipedia regularly, and since they are related projects, they're really easy they're really complementary, so they can help each other in identifying and filling those knowledge gaps. And then using queries to generate time-sensitive data and share these visualizations. So Wikidata is updated very regularly. Some of Wikidata points to other data repositories to get more time-sensitive things on there, and showing changes over time visually is a great way to kind of monitor projects and show progress. Okay, another really important thing about Wikidata that's not mentioned enough is documentation. Wouldn't it be great if there were a manual or like a step-by-step process that you could follow to know how to use Wikidata and do projects? And that's kind of up to the documentation on Wikidata. So there are some tool walkthroughs. I think there could always be more. There are some YouTube videos. I think there could always be more. And if you have a knack or a gift for explaining things to other people, I would encourage you to document these experiences. This is a great project that you can do on Wikidata. Walking through things step by step is very integral to these pieces of documentation. One thing that I notice in working more and more on Wikidata is once I'm used to something, I forget how hard it is when you first start it. So it's really great if you can kind of capture that process as you do it, because then you can share it with anybody and they'll be able to do it. Sharing queries is also a really useful way of documenting your processes. Anyone can share a query. Any query you write can be shortened to that little URL and shared and posted on the example query page, or you can just share it on a wiki project. And then just any way to gather resources to train other community members. So if you are embarking on a project to translate your collection from your institution to Wikidata, tracking workflows is super important. I did this, followed by this, and I used these 3 tools to help me with X, Y, and Z things. And useful resources outside of Wikidata. So if you're pulling in things from schema.org, or if you're relying heavily on a lot of RDF vocabulary, just making sure that there are places others can go to kind of get on the same page. Documentation is super important. And then there are just some like general dynamics that you want to be aware of when you're doing these projects. Establish a scope or a goal, understand your relationship with the data. Wikidata is a community-based project, so you want to make sure that you allow time for inclusion and support with the community. So if you do decide to make a property, you should realize that there is a community feedback period of 7 days or so where other people can chime in and say, I love this, I think this should be changed or updated. So you will be working with the community, and that's something that you should build into any project. Just resources in general, how much time can you put into this? Do I need support of other people, both internally and externally? So establish that. Patience, Wikidata does have a learning curve. It's not always easy to find all the resources that you need right away. And some of them don't exist yet, so it's good to be aware of that. And then you do need to be able to let go of your data, because once it's on Wikidata, other people can add to it and contribute to it, and it can be used. So that's something to keep in mind with any Wikidata project, is it belongs to the community after you add it. So that's kind of my overview of different project dynamics on Wikidata, different ways to frame a project. And I've listed some examples here that I referred to in my presentation. So if you're more of a visual learner, or if you need some concrete examples to understand what a workflow looks like on Wikidata, I've listed them here. And let me just pop out of my presentation briefly and share a different page, which kind of walks through these links. So this is something that Andrew Lee and some others put together, which is the linked data workflow. You can see it's boxed up, and it gives a list of tools and links and different ways that you can use these tools for Wikidata. I think Liam already shared this in the chat, but this is a complete list of wiki projects, and this is linked in my presentation, which I'll upload once we're done with this. This is a specific wiki project dedicated to metadata that also includes some workflows that you can use. And then this is a large tool directory called Hayes Tool Directory that just lists a lot of tools that are associated with Wikidata that you can use and implement in a project. But I do want to be cognizant of time, and we're at the 12:30 mark, at least where I am. So let me pause and just see, or I guess that's all I have to say for my presentation. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. I listed my email there. And if you're interested at all in taking a Wikidata course, feel free to reach out to me too, because that's what I do. I teach Wikidata. So thank you so much to LD4 for having me, for Liam and for Jackie for coordinating this. I really appreciate it. And I'll stick around if anyone has any questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Will. And yes, there has been quite a few questions in the chat. We've been moving them across to the Q&A document. Lots of questions about how to find data models, how to contribute to data models, and the manner of requesting new properties, for example, and some questions about how to find methods of pulling data from Wikidata and the different places you would go to for doing the different kinds of ways you would pull data. I request, again, anyone to put those questions into the Q&A document because the chat here in Zoom will disappear when you close the page. With that, Jackie, I throw back to you for our concluding moments of this session today.
Okay, so I thought we have heard so much from our speakers, and some wonderful questions and answers have been provided throughout the Q&A. And I would like to have the floor open, take the opportunity while this many of you are here who has begun the journey of Wikidata for your local collections, be it bibliographic data describing the image, describing a book, describing an article of a journal, or authority, identity management control activities. Would you like to share with us what you think that these working session help resolving some of the uncertainty you might have, or created additional questions and barrier that you think you didn't think of? So please unmute your mic and take it from here. This is your opportunity to voice your experience and your concern, and maybe in some way, because a lot of the people who are on the list here have relationship in the Wikimedia environment, and also they are leaders of their institution, and they have experimenting something that may provide answers to the questions that you may have. So please don't be shy.
Well, it sounds like there's 130 odd people who are being shy. Can I ask, did anyone in the audience would like to share something that they particularly learned today that they really didn't know about before, they found that will serve them personally quite well, and they're very glad they learned about it today because it might have otherwise passed them by?
L1 said this is all new for this, and curious about how to even start one. Have you found our speakers giving you the necessary references or links for you to dig into the documentations, or finding ways to resolve the obstacles that you have come across? In the chat, Bob Kowalski said he starts by learning. And Louis Raybach, I apologize if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, was saying that was glad to learn about the queue in the query structures. And when that happens, there's no English label. And
yes, Lois, that the point you're making there about when there's a query result that shows the Q number rather than a label does mean that there is no label in the language that you asked for. But you can change the query to ask for a series of languages in succession to say, show me the label in English, and if it doesn't exist, in Russian, and if it doesn't exist in Russian, then in French, and so on. And if it doesn't exist in any of them, it will show you the Q number eventually. If you're looking for people's names, that will generally give you the same thing, regardless of what language in most scripts. But it's an interesting way of adapting the question. So if you're asking for things that do definitely have different labels in different languages, for example, concepts, it's a nice way of showing different results and different coverage across languages or fallback languages. That's all adaptable in the penultimate line of the query service query in Sparkle. There's various people adding their comments in the chat, which is excellent, but do feel free to open the microphone yourselves if you'd like to show what you learned to the group verbally. Iman is asking about how we can enrich Wikidata with other languages. This is obviously a specialization of Mahir. I encourage you to contact him personally, Iman. But in effect, Wikidata is a multilingual or language agnostic project. Everything is listed by its Q number or its L number, so it doesn't require you have a separate website, which is fantastic because all languages can benefit from the same data set. You can change in your profile, in your user preferences, the default language for your user interface and set the drop-down options, the pre-filled options for which languages labels are shown to you. Usually that would be the languages you speak or the languages of the country you are in. You can do that using the Babel tool on your user page. If someone who is listening could add the link to that relevant template onto the Q&A page, that would be very helpful. This allows you to have Wikidata show you the existence or non-existence of labels, descriptions, and aliases in specific languages that are of importance to you whenever you hit Wikidata items without having to query for them.
Oh, and one thing I wanted to add to what you just said, if you have language skills, one thing you could do was just add labels. That's something very simple, low, high impact, but low commitment, time commitment thing to do. You could just go add labels in a bunch of different languages if you are confident enough to do that in those languages. And that's a really big help. I find that, like, as an English speaker, I find it really useful when people like do that sort of thing, and it allows me to more effectively communicate multilingually when people are able to contribute that way.
And you get to produce a lot of interesting things when you do localize a number of items in some specific domain. So there's a language spoken in parts of Eastern India called Santali. It's one of the indigenous languages there. And there's a lot of items for individual railway stations in India on Wikidata. Now that there is a Santali label on each of those railway stations and the stations themselves have lots of extra data on top of it, it's now feasible to think about, okay, let's produce a map of India's rail network in Santali. So that gives you an idea of how wide impact such an activity might be. As long as you do it a lot. I mean, some languages get a lot more labels added because of bots or because some people are just very much into advancing their language on Wikidata. But the more you do, I mean, it just comes down to which items you choose and whether you choose to localize an entire domain or not, or some specific subset of items, which you actually frequently use. So.
Now, Krista Strickler mentioned she was intrigued by the idea of starting a wiki project and would like to explore more. Were you able to get how you started through the 3 working sessions from our speakers, or do you have enough information that you think you could take it when you begin to plan your project? Excellent. In chat, she said she had enough information to start. So that was very good that the speakers are able to help you get started.
I see Joan has commented in the chat saying that it was a very useful presentation or a series of presentations, particularly to determine how and whether to include Wikidata in a metadata course. So learning about all the different ways and resources of Wikidata has been tremendously useful. If you're teaching a course for people learning about metadata as a concept, Wikidata is fascinating, I would suggest. Obviously, I'm biased, because it is what I and other people call a sort of a metadata of metadatas, a gazetteer of gazetteers. It is not itself a metadata standard, but a repository that links to many other standards and systems, which is an interesting way to use as a crosswalk among structured forms of data that are otherwise completely independent. There's nothing else out there that simultaneously connects to IMDb for movie information, and also the Getty art history vocabulary, and also what we've been talking about at the beginning session about the American military academy roster from the 1800s. So the ability to connect between multiple independent data sets with their own unique or completely independent metadata systems is quite special for Wikidata. That does, however, make it quite scary in that Wikidata is a mongrel. It speaks all the different languages and doesn't have any preferences. So it is not neat. Metadata librarians are trained to be neat and things should be orderly. Wikidata is unique in that we are simultaneously building the metadata structure and the content in the database simultaneously. That is a scary idea, that you can adjust the properties, the metadata fields, with the content already in them. But it's fun.
That's a really good point. I've met a number of catalogers that find Wikidata very frustrating, and our attitude of just like, there are no rules, let's just make it up as we go along. Like, who says you can't do that? And they really don't like that sort of thing.
Zen and the art of metadata management.
I think to have conflicting statements exist side by side is a challenge for librarians, especially catalogers and metadata professionals, because over the years, we have been trained to think differently like this. And so it is a huge learning curve for a lot of us to have to let go that strict interpretation of rules and regulations in terms of applying descriptive content.
Yes, Jackie just mentioned conflicting statements. That is something that is quite unique to Wikidata's construction and intentional. The idea that you can have multiple statements on the same item that say conflicting, not as different, but actually conflicting things. The famous example is the item for Israel and the property for capital city. Now, the purpose here, unlike every other metadata system, is to enable you as a user and the querier of the data to interrogate the data and make up your own mind. This is digital humanities in action. It does, however, require a different mindset. This is the value of ranking, and I encourage you to look up the concept of Wikidata statement ranks, as well as the necessity for referencing each statement, because two perfectly valid references can be placed next to two competing statements. It just depends who you think is the important person to listen to.
There is a question from Thomas Pease regarding the connection between Wikidata and schema.org. Anyone want to take it? In the chat, Mahil answers linkage between Wikidata items and their descriptions, as well as between items and information about their site links. In RDF uses schema.org predicates.
That seems to have answered Thomas's question based on the thank you comment back in the chat. I suspect that the Q&A, the verbal Q&A session is coming to a conclusion. Our participant numbers are slowly decreasing, and that is perfectly fine. I would encourage people to head over, as I have been encouraging throughout this conversation, head over to the Q&A page. I will link once more to the full Google Docs URL into the chat just there. This has a subheading for each of the presentations we've had today. It also has a subheading for each of the presentations we will have tomorrow on the same time, but a different Zoom link for 3 more presentations. That page and all of its conversations will remain in existence, whereas the conversation here in the chat on this Zoom call will disappear once we all leave it. The presentations themselves have been recorded, but I'm reasonably confident that the conversation chat history does not come with the recording. So I encourage you to continue moving over onto that Q&A document for any further follow-up questions. And the 2 first presentations have their slides available and linked from the Q&A page. Will said in his presentation that he would share his slides after the fact. Will, if you could do so and link them from your shared documentation page on the website for the conference, and also in that Q&A page, that would be very helpful. I just pasted the links one more time for Susan. And with that, I have nothing more to add. Jackie?
And want to encourage you to come back tomorrow. There's, see the programs over here, and we will see you tomorrow, 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 11 a.m. Pacific Time. So thank you all. And I'm gonna start the recording.